Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it is I, Hidden Flame, and welcome back for another episode of the Final Fantasy Timeline. Before I begin with my next episode, I want to apologize for the very long time frame between this episode and the last. It's just been very hectic on my side. From losing most of my files in a hard drive purge to working very long at work and not having time to dedicate to this series. But I have ideas on how to make it work, so hopefully you will see more of these videos in the coming future. So as a disclaimer, before I begin this video, I will say it again. I know personally each of the games are its own separate universe, but as there are connections between games, I am going to continue to attempt to put all 16 games in the proper order of how they appear via all these connections in a single timeline. So please stop saying in the comments that they're separate universes. I know this. So with that out of the way, let's continue. So, the episode we are going to go with today is the War of the Magi and what it truly is. There are many different theories on what it could be. Could it be Final Fantasy VIII's Sorceress War? Could it be Final Fantasy X with all the summoners? I have found one that's based off of Final Fantasy IV, but I'm going to do a deeper look into what the War of the Magi actually and truly is. I could be wrong, but again, it's a theory, and it's going to be the connections we do with Final Fantasy VI. So sit back and let me try to break this down. Before we begin, we first need to know what the War of the Magi is. So, using the Final Fantasy fandom Wikipedia page, here is what it says about the War of the Magi. 3 gods descended from the heavens and, fearing one another's power, begin to war. The mortals caught among the fighting become espers, and they were forced to fight as slaves to the gods. The gods realized the chaos their fighting caused and agreed to seal their power away. With the last of their fading magic, the gods returned the espers' free will to them before petrifying themselves. The last words they left the espers were, "Never must we be woken." Espers and humans lived in peace for a time until another war broke out when humans attempted to seize the esper power for themselves. Espers and humans warred, and humans infused with esper magic came to an existence called Magi. One battle during the war took place in the ancient castle where the king, an esper named Odin, was petrified, defending the castle from its enemies, including enemy espers and a powerful sorcerer. The esper Valagarmanda was frozen and buried to be discovered 1,000 years later in the northern mines. Various other espers became magicite, and their shards were lost to the world. There came to be two Ultima Weapons. The first was a destructive monster with incredible magical powers, and the other was a powerful sword, which took its power from the user's vitality. As the war drew to a close, the espers created a new realm where they could live in peace and fled there en masse, taking with them the statues of the warring triad. Left to their own conflicts, the humans turned on the Magi, believing them to be the cause of the war, and many were hunted down and killed. A few escaped and found the remote village of Thamasa. With the espers and Magi gone, magic faded from the world and into legends. Now, what does all this mean on the other games? Well, it's quite simple. Some of these warring triad have very distinct looks about them. Let me show you what I mean. This is the character Goddess. She is the female of the warring triad. If you look really careful at her design, you will see something peculiar about her. She is coming out, or is the head of another head, which, if you have played Final Fantasy X, you would notice that it looks a lot like Untitled. Now, this is really the only character that I have found with this design. Now, this doesn't mean this is specifically Untitled as the goddess. It's just the only one I personally have found with this design. The next of the three we are going to look at is Demon. Now, people don't really take a look at this character and see anything peculiar. Like, it's just a normal demon. But in Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VIII, you have a specific monster. First, in Final Fantasy X, you have Omega, or Omega Weapon. Now, it doesn't really look like the character from 6, but there is another Omega that looks eerily similar, and that is from Final Fantasy VIII. This and Ultima Weapon have similar appearances. Omega does not have a weapon, Ultima does. And then the third and final of the triad is Fiend. Now, this one took me some time to find out who the closest look would be, because you really don't see many multi-armed demon-like characters, but I found one. In Final Fantasy XIV, you meet Chaos. Now, in this battle, this is the Chaos from Final Fantasy I. So, this means, from what I have found with the closest possible connections, is this. The War of the Magi took place with Final Fantasy X, 8, and 1. It seems far-fetched until you realize all 3 of these games deal with time travel. In Final Fantasy 1, you have the infinite loop. The Warriors of Light go back to the past to fight chaos. Final Fantasy 8, the team goes to the future to fight Ultimacia. In Final Fantasy 10, Titus goes to the future with the help of Sin. So it's not impossible that these 3 games are connected. In Final Fantasy 1, the team goes 2,000 years into the past. In Final Fantasy X, Tidus goes 1,000 years into the future. And in Final Fantasy VIII, while there is no specific time jump as to where it goes forward or backwards, they do compress time in order to get to their specific location. I'm sorry, time compression just doesn't sit positively with me. While it's not officially canon because the story was never finished, in Final Fantasy X 2.5, which was a book or a novel or whatever people call it these days, Tidus and Yuna are transported to Besaid 1,000 years previously, back to the time where Tidus is from. So with all of this time travel, it is possible that somewhere along this line, Chaos, Unalesca, and Ultima Weapon got together, whether it's in the time compression from Ultimacia, whether all of this happened at one specific time and then broke off, where each of these triad members get resurrected at different parts in time and space, or just a fun little Easter egg, since all of these games, except number 1, came out after Final Fantasy VI. Though most of the theories I have personally seen state that all of this happened in Final Fantasy IV because it's heavy with magic, the king is named Odin, the castle is destroyed, and something about the Lunarians. Actually, please hold, I will bring it up. Okay, found it. This is coming from thegamer.com. I will post a link in the description if you want to take a look at it. So, links between Final Fantasy IV and VI can be made if you consider that the War of the Magi was the war that occurred during the events of Final Fantasy IV. It's possible that the Triad descending to the world was a reference to 3 unnamed but powerful entities known as the Lunarians. One strong story link between the games occurs during Tale Told of the War of the Magi, when an Esper named Odin tried to defend the ancient castle from invaders, but was defeated by an unknown sorcerer as a result. In Final Fantasy IV, Odin, who was also known as the King of Baron, was supposedly killed by Cognizant. It is possible he may have instead been killed by Golbez, but with the aid of Cognizant, which would explain who the mysterious sorcerer from the legend told in Final Fantasy VI. In addition, the Baron Castle has many architectural similarities to the ancient castle. The maps of the two games share many similarities, and the Baron's castle's placement on the map is located where Final Fantasy VI's Figaro Castle is now situated. Interestingly, Figaro Castle features an optional side quest which takes you to an ancient castle, possibly a relic from the Baron's castle, and it contains the Magi's site of Odin. This seems to be a direct parallel from the events of 4. Now, I personally don't like this specific theory because it doesn't explain the actual war besides the Fiends versus the team. It makes sense on the Odin side, but it doesn't make sense on the war side. Now, if somebody went into deeper explanation on how the 3 warring triad caused all this to happen, outside of a possibility of the Lunarians, then I take it for more granted. But it doesn't seem to fit in my mind. Another one can be found on the Final Fantasy fandom Wikipedia under the intergame connections for Final Fantasy X is the reasons for the triad. In this person's theory, Doom, Goddess, and Poltergeist is represented by Yuna, Sen, and Seymour, which personally should be relooked because, as I mentioned earlier, Goddess looks more like Yunalesca. It does say here that the goddess is essentially made up of 2 parts. The statue of a woman stands on a Medusa head, similar to Yunalesca's 3rd form. The woman has brown hair in the same style to Yuna, and behind the figure is a large golden disc resembling a sun. Now, if we treat the statues as faith, rather than the petrified remains of the gods, you can see the symbolism. Yuna is shown appearing to break free from the mind or the head of Yunalesca with the sun in her back. In 10, Yuna ended the summoner's pilgrimage started by Yunalesca at the behest of her father Yevon. With the aid of Titus, his name means sun. As corny as that is, it doesn't fit, but it sort of does fit. Take it for what you will. The next is Fiend. It's a large, fairly bubbly, blobby, black shape, originally called Doom. Does this really look like a blob to anybody else? No, that's what I thought. They are saying that Doom is sin, the bringer of destruction, and is the essence of the Fiend left behind by the faith of the final Aeon. Its appearance is similar to Braska's final form. Hold. Unless I'm blind, I don't see the difference. I really don't. Anyway, let's continue on. The final one is Poltergeist, or Demon, whatever you would prefer. Again, it appears to have two parts, or two defined faces. One is that of a humanoid man, the other is that of a beast, which may be a separate entity of some kind. At any rate, the human seems to be in command of the beast from their particular body language. It is largely irrelevant, but reinforces the point. The name Poltergeist serves this theory well, for in 10, there were 3 groups at the war. Yuna's Guardians, Yevon, and Seymour Guadet. When Seymour came back from the dead, he was always had a sidekick of some sort. As Seymour Flux, he carried a large staff, similar to Poltergeist's halberd. And finally, their 2 parts are indeed one body. Their arrangement mirrors that of Anima, particularly the more feral face below, with arms stretched out, similar to Anima's overdrive. You know, I could sit here all day just tearing apart this theory. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop on this particular one because it makes no sense. So, what I am going to do or say is this. Final Fantasy VI is a complicated game. I'm not going to deny it. There is so much about it that connects to other games. As an example, the World of Darkness at the very end shows up in 15. The Magic Tech armor shows up in 15. The idea of cars and trains and airships, that's Final Fantasy VIII. So I could go all day just on 6. Will I? No. What I am going to say is this. The War of the Magi happened before the games. Now, we learn about the War of the Magi in 6, and it took place 1,000 years before the game. Everything in Final Fantasy takes place 1,000 years beforehand. There is no definitive placement of the Magi War, but the triad appears in various games, as I have shown before. So, we have Final Fantasy VI. The War of the Magi is explained in detail if you play 6. And you even fight the Triad. This doesn't mean they die. What I believe is that 6 comes before 1, 8, and 10. Where? Beats me. I don't have that information. At least I don't have it yet. So, let's just say 6 comes before all of these games. Wait, before you guys start putting in the comments down below, yes, I mentioned the War of the Triad. It's Final Fantasy X in a previous video. Well, things change. That's what happens when you try to make connections and try to turn something that isn't into something that is. You make mistakes. You make issues. And that's going to be continuous as I go through this series. And I'm going to be making these videos as how I would see them and the connections I find. And going forward, I will reference and I will source all the theories that I find. But from this video onward, I'm going to use my own words. I'm going to use no script. I'm going to use notes. So, this is just something I'm going to be explaining to you guys each time. Everything is my opinion, whether it's true or not. Think of this as the third attempt, because everything beforehand is wrong. So going forward, we're going to attempt a retcon of a retcon. So hopefully I will have another video posted soon. No guarantees when, because I cannot make any guarantees. But please, help me out. Give me ideas. And give me advice. Did I do good on this one? Do you think my theory works? Before I leave, I want to say that the Evil East timeline in the last video is canonical. It is official. That is the official Evil East timeline. No need to change it. So, it is part of my timeline. No need to change it. No need to retcon it. And if you guys want to go check it out, I'll put a link in the description. Or just watch the playlist. But for now, thank you. And I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.